So in this short video, I'm going to take you through what typical vertical ground reaction force profiles look like for running, walking and counter movement jump. So you know what to look for, and therefore when pathology or rehabilitation may impact what you're seeing in your vertical ground reaction force trace. So first up, running. Running is a little bit unique because there are actually considered three typical vertical ground reaction force profiles. You can see all three on the figure in front of you. So the black line is what we refer to as a rear foot strike. That means that heel hits the ground, rocks over, and then you toe off. The red line is a midfoot strike. That is where there's simultaneous contact with the heel and the ball of the foot, and then you rock through and toe off. And forefoot strike, that is when the toes hit the ground first, and sometimes the heel will come down and hit the ground as the tibia rotates over it. Sometimes it won't, as in sprinting, the heel normally stays off the ground, and then you toe off on your toes. So you have a rear foot strike, heel first, midfoot strike, simultaneous contact with the ball of the foot and the toes, and a forefoot strike where it's toes first. You can see that the biggest difference in the force traces are the fact that the black line, which is the rear foot strike, has this impact that occurs in the first 20 seconds of 20% of stance. So this is known as the impact phase, and the peak that you can see at around 2 body weights is known as the impact peak. This only occurs in such a distinguished fashion in a rear foot strike. In a midfoot strike, you can see that there's actually a bit of plateau occurring around that 20% stance phase. And in a forefoot strike, you can actually see that it's relatively smooth from the initial contact at 0 all the way up to what's known as the active peak at around 2.5 body weights occurring at mid-stance, so 50% of stance. Following the impact phase, you can see that regardless of foot strikes, they follow a very similar pattern. They rise up to what we call the active phase, and then they drop back down. So there will be deviation in vertical ground reaction force just simply by how an individual hits the ground with their foot, but this is something that you can monitor, and this is something that you may be looking at from an asymmetry point of view. Are the left and right doing similar things? And with certain injuries. So running-related injuries, forefoot strike has been suggested as a way of reducing pain in patellofemoral symptomatic runners. Because when we transition to a forefoot strike, we actually now load up our Achilles and our calf muscular tendon unit much more than when we rear foot strike. But in fact, when we're rear foot striking, we're loading up our tibialis anterior and sending a lot more force through the patellofemoral joint as well. So the different foot strikes can give us an indication of the different loading that is going on within the lower limb. What we can also take from force data is we can break it down into acceleration, velocity, and displacement data, remembering that this is acceleration of the centre of mass, velocity of the centre of mass, and displacement of the centre of mass. So by using force equals mass times acceleration, we simply divide our vertical force by acceleration, and that means our acceleration profile looks exactly like it would for the rear foot striker as it did for the vertical ground reaction force. In this figure, I've drawn on what we will call the body weight line. This is the line of force that we would expect just by someone standing on the force plate. Remember, we exert one body weight force just standing still. So anything above this line means we're exerting force greater than our body weight, anything below this line means we're exerting force less than our body weight. So this is the acceleration profile, and just by looking at that acceleration profile, I can tell you that the velocity will have a zero velocity at around mid-stance, and this is what we typically see. The reason I can tell you this is because our acceleration follows an upward trajectory. Even with that impact phase, it is on the up, by and large, during the first 50% stance. It then reaches a peak, and then it decreases down until the foot has left the ground. So I know at that peak acceleration, velocity must be zero, because it's changing velocity direction. As you can see, we're at negative velocity when we initially hit the ground, because we are now going downwards, and then at mid-stance, we go back, and we're now pushing up off the ground, and we have a positive velocity. I can also then infer from that that at mid-stance, where the velocity is zero, I will have my peak displacement, or in this case it's a minimum displacement, but it's the peak amount that my centre of mass moves during ground contact phase. So where the velocity is zero, my displacement is the most. And you can see it's a nice U shape, because when we run, we hit the ground, we bend down, and then we push back up. So just by knowing the shape of the force curve, where it has one big peak at the top, I can also hypothesize what velocity and displacement will happen. And you can do this with any force trace, okay? I'm only going to break it down to this level with the running one, but it means we can do a number of things in terms of how So in this short video, I'm going to take you through our body weight, and you can with the force curve, where it has one big peak at the top. I can also hypothesize what velocity and displacement will happen. And you can do this with any force trace. Okay, I'm only going to break it down to this level with the running one. But it means we can do a number of things in terms of how we are subjectively assessing that ground reaction force. When we combine all of that information in regards to acceleration, velocity and displacement, bear in mind, okay, this is our body weight line, and anything below that body weight line means we're exerting less force than body weight. Anything above means we're exerting higher force than body weight. When we are below that body weight line during the initial impact, we have a negative acceleration because we're below the body weight line. We also have a negative velocity, if you remember from the slide before, because we are going down towards the ground. So that means we are accelerating downwards, because when the acceleration and velocity act in the same way, we are accelerating in that direction. During this portion of the curve, okay, we are now having a positive acceleration because our body weight line, we've risen above that. So we're now positively accelerating, but we still have a negative velocity. So remember, we're still going down because we haven't hit mid-stance yet. So that means we are now slowing down as we're going downwards. So we are decelerating downwards. This is what helps slow us down before we then start to accelerate back up again. So we're above the body weight line, so we've still got positive acceleration. But this time now we also have a positive velocity. Because remember, after mid-stance, our velocity has now gone into the positive phase, it's gone over zero. So this means we're now accelerating upwards. And then to finish off, when we go below the body weight line again, so we have a negative acceleration, but we have a positive velocity, it means we're decelerating upwards just to that last bit as we toe off from the ground. So this is what we can start to infer from the ground reaction force. It gives us quite a lot of information. Okay, so this is a walking profile. I'm not going to do a breakdown like I just did for running for this. You can actually go home and try this yourself. But I wanted to show you different kind of profiles of what happens in individuals with knee osteoarthritis. And in this specific study, they had a group of individuals who had knee osteoarthritis, and then they treated them with an injection to essentially help numb the pain. And they followed them up 1 week, 3 months, and 6 months after that injection. You can see that there is a difference primarily in when they had osteoarthritis and then when they had the injection to reduce the levels of pain from that osteoarthritis. So the osteoarthritis baseline is the black dashed line, and what you can see is actually what happens is they hit the ground, we have an increase in force going on during that loading phase, and then there's almost a constant force occurring before it then decreases and the foot leaves the ground. Whereas in the other ones, we see what we would expect to see during walking, which is this double hump figure. So we see a peak occurring during that initial loading waiting phase, then during mid-stance we have a dip where where we pivot over our leg, our central mass is at the highest, and then we're in the push-off driving forwards phase. In that push-off phase we then see a secondary peak occurring. And in a healthy gait you would expect the first and second peak to be relatively the same magnitude, so reaching the same amount of force. But we can see in the knee osteoarthritis group, they basically have a relatively stable force, which means they're missing out on that cyclical loading and unloading and then reloading of the lower limb, which is suggesting potentially is a bad thing for knee osteoarthritis, because cyclical loading and unloading actually is a way of helping our bones to strengthen. And by having more of a constant load, we miss out on exposing the lower limb to that dynamic cyclical loading. So if I was looking at a walking gait ground reaction force profile, I would be looking for those distinct two peaks, similar magnitude, with a dip in the middle identified as mid-stance. And it should be a relatively smooth curve that you're looking for as well, so no abrupt changes, no rapid spikes occurring. This is a counter movement jump. Hopefully you're quite familiar with this by now based on what you've been taught in the first and second years. With counter movement jump, we always want to try and cut our data to when the movement is beginning, so when the movement essentially dips below what our body weight line is, which in this case is just over 700 in this figure. And this is a typical ground reaction force profile with the vertical direction for counter movement jump. The first bit, where we go below what would be our body weight line, where we have that downward phase, is called the unweighting phase. This is where we are bending our knees and then looking to generate propulsive force and push off the ground. And then we have an area of force that goes above that 700 line, if that's our body weight line. And this is called our weighted phase. You can expect to see a magnitude, a peak force occurring, so relatively high magnitude, almost over 2 body weights there. And then we leave the ground and it tails off. You should always see a zero ground reaction force occurring during counter movement jump. So make sure every counter movement jump has that zeroing, because they have now left the force plane. And then we hit the ground and you can see this rapid spike in vertical ground reaction force with a really high magnitude of basically 4 body weights going along. So we're now impacting the ground with much greater force than that which we left the ground with. And then there will be a period of stabilisation going on where we actually see some ripples, changes in the vertical ground reaction force, and then it would eventually level off to our body weight line. So we see a much more rapid change in force during the landing. This is a breakdown of the counter movement jump. I'm not going to spend as much time as I did on running, but this is the kind of thing that you can start to do with a counter movement jump. You can again go from vertical force through to acceleration through to velocity, and then use your velocity to calculate a number of things and break the phases of the movement up further. So like I said, when you get below the body weight line, that is point A, the movement has started, and you enter the unweighted phase, which occurs to point B, where you go back up to above body weight. This would be the unweighting impulse. Now the unweighting impulse must be less than the weighting impulse, which is from point B to essentially around about point G, to get you off the ground. If the weighting phase impulse is not higher than the unweighting phase impulse, you do not have enough momentum to get off the ground. So it's essential that that period of unweighting is longer, bigger. Overall, that area is greater in magnitude than the unweighting phase. But you can see that you can use the velocity to break that down even further into a braking and propulsive phase. We don't typically do this an awful lot by mechanics because actually it doesn't give you as much information, even though it seems a little bit more detailed than the unweighting and weighting phase, which gives you the most relevant information most of the time. Point C is actually the minimum velocity achieved, and that will occur at around the point when the vertical force reaches your body weight line. Point F on the orange line is our peak takeoff velocity, so how much speed have we managed to generate upwards to get off the ground. Point E on the curve is our peak takeoff force, and then on the other side you can see J, which I mentioned before, is our peak landing force. So if I was using this in a rehabilitation context, I'd be looking at from point A to point G, which is our takeoff phase, from more of a performance perspective of how much momentum are you able to generate to get off the ground. But then in the landing phase, this is really important to understand how someone can attenuate that force when they hit the ground. How much control, how rapid a rate of loading is going on. The greater the rate of loading, potentially the stiffer that landing is, which may potentially be an injury risk factor, but also actually a very soft landing could conversely be an injury risk factor. So rehabilitation is less conclusive than some of the performance data we often see. But you can infer different things from the takeoff and the push-off phase. So going back to this, which I showed you in your introductory video, is the counter movement jump of an injured and uninjured limb following ACL surgery. So that dotted uninjured limb is what we've just seen on the previous figure, and the black line is the involved limb. You can see that there's a real discrepancy going on in the ability to generate momentum off that involved limb. So we have a very, very small area of the curve above body weight, that is meaning our jump height is not as high as it should be, because we aren't able to counteract the unweighting phase that's going on. So there is a real issue with that transition between unweighting to weighting that's occurring. In actual fact, when we look at the landing, though, we can see that there isn't much difference. Now, you may interpret this as going, well, the involved limb is as good as the uninvolved limb at attenuating force. But remember, this individual is unlikely to have jumped as high off of their involved limb as their uninvolved limb. That means for a jump height that is less or lower than another jump height, they're still exerting a similar amount of force at the same rate. So let's extrapolate that. If they were then jumping at the same height, now if they're involved in uninvolved limb, you would actually expect greater loading rates and potentially higher landing forces. So, though on balance it might look okay, when we actually take into the fact of propulsion and potential that they have jumped as high, this is potentially showing us that the involved limb isn't able to attenuate the forces as effectively when jumping to a lower height. So that's a brief overview for you of ground reaction force profiles. We've gone through running, how to break it down into acceleration, velocity and displacement. We've then gone through what a typical walk-in pattern looks like, and you might want to go away and try and break that down into acceleration, velocity and displacement. And then we've gone into some detail about counter movement jump and the potential to look at the push-off, momentum building phase, as well as the landing phase, and what we typically see, some things that we can quantify, and how we can infer, bringing all of those things together to also look at the landing phase. Hopefully this should be useful for how you go about quantifying things throughout the rest of the module.